Now we will read Right to Freedom covering Article 19 to Article 22. So, Right to Freedom covering Article 19 to Article 22. So, we will start with Article 19. Now, I have already told you that there are some fundamental rights which are only available to citizens and not to foreigners. And what are those fundamental rights? Those are fundamental rights under Article 15, 16, 19, 29 and 30. That means fundamental rights available under Article 19 is only applicable to citizens and not to foreigners. This is one thing. And now we'll see what Article 19 is talking about. This Article 19 is talking about protection of certain rights, and that is regarding freedom of speech. So Article 19 clause 1 clause A, it is talking about freedom of speech and expression. So Article 19 clause 1 clause A is talking about that all the citizens shall have the right of freedom of speech and expression. And when Article 19 is saying that every citizen have the freedom of speech and expression, that means they can express their expression by word of mouth or by printing or by writing or by making a picture in any form. So this right under this fundamental right under Article 19, that is freedom of speech and expression, can be expressed freely by the citizen by word of mouth or by printing or by writing or by drawing picture, that can be in any form. And this article, over a period of years, Supreme Court has interpreted in such a way that Supreme Court has interpreted this article in such a way that we have also got some other rights that were not originally mentioned in the Constitution, but Supreme Court has interpreted Article 19, freedom of speech and expression, in such a way that now the freedom of press is also part of freedom of speech and expression. So this freedom of press was not explicitly mentioned in the original Constitution under Article 19 clause 1 clause A, but Supreme Court has interpreted this article in such a way that now freedom of press also comes under freedom of speech and expression. Then Supreme Court has interpreted this article in such a way that now right to speech also implies that right to silence as well. And when Supreme Court is saying that right to speech implies the right to silence as well, that means government should take steps to curb the noise pollution in the society, to curb the noise pollution in the environment. So Article 19, which is only talking about freedom of speech and expression, that is not only the literal meaning. Supreme Court has interpreted this article in such a vast way that now freedom of press is also a fundamental right under freedom of speech and expression. Right to silence is also another fundamental right under this article. But this fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression is not an absolute fundamental right. So this is not absolute. State can impose reasonable restriction on the exercise of freedom of speech and expression on certain grounds. And what are those grounds on which state can impose reasonable restriction? Now we will discuss those grounds. In total, currently there are 8 grounds on which state can impose reasonable restriction. Now we will discuss those reasonable restrictions one by one. So one reasonable restriction is sovereignty and integrity of India. So that means you can say whatever you want to say. That is your fundamental right under freedom of speech and expression. But when you are saying something and that is going against the sovereignty and integrity of India, that means you are saying against the sovereignty of India, you are saying something which is against the integrity of India, then your freedom of speech and expression can be curbed by the state. That means that you cannot do. That means by your speech you cannot go against the sovereignty and integrity of India. That is one reasonable restriction. Then also, through your while expressing your freedom of speech and expression, you cannot go against the security of state. That means security of the state is also another ground on which your freedom of speech and expression can be curbed. That is another reasonable restriction. Then another reasonable restriction is friendly relationship with foreign states. So that is another restriction. Then another one is, you can say, public order. Then another one is decency, or you can say morality. Other is contempt of court. Then defamation, and then at last incitement to an offense. So these are the 8 grounds. So these are 8 reasonable restrictions on which your freedom of speech and expression can be curbed. And what are those? Sovereignty and integrity of India. That means through your freedom of speech and expression you cannot go against sovereignty and integrity of India. You cannot give a speech which can threat the security of the state. You cannot say something which can then suppose you are giving a speech, and by that speech relation with foreign state may get hampered, then your freedom of speech can be curbed. Then another ground is public order. Then decency, morality is another ground. Contempt of court, defamation, incitement to an offense. These are the reasonable restrictions of freedom of speech and expression. And these reasonable restrictions are mentioned under Article 19, Clause 2. Now we will read Article 19, Clause 1, Clause B, and that is right of assembly. That is right to hold meetings and to take out processions. But then you have to consider two things, that is, this assembly must be unarmed and this should be peaceful. That means right to assembly is a fundamental right under Article 19, but that assembly should be unarmed and should be peaceful as well. And what are the reasonable restrictions in this fundamental right? The reasonable restrictions are public order and sovereignty and integrity of nation of India. So these are two reasonable restrictions under right of assembly, and those are public order and sovereignty and integrity of India. Then under Article 19, Clause 1, Clause C, his right to form unions, associations and cooperative societies. So all citizens shall have the freedom to form associations or unions, and this clause of cooperative society, this was originally not present. This was added by 97th Constitutional Amendment Act of 2011. And what are the reasonable restrictions? The reasonable restrictions are sovereignty and integrity of India and public order. And there is another reasonable restriction, that is morality. Now Article 19 clause 1 clause D, which is talking about right of movement. That means this is saying that this article is saying that citizens can move freely throughout the territory of India. Now this right is given to promote the national feeling, because the citizens can move freely throughout the territory of India. That means the citizens can go anywhere. Suppose there is a citizen who is from a particular state, but that does not mean that he or she cannot go to any other part of the country, to any other state. He or she can do so. That means there is a right of movement, and this is provided to promote the national feeling. And when I was teaching you the preamble of Indian Constitution, there is a word mentioned. The objective of Indian Constitution is fraternity. So if you think, then you will understand this fraternity. The feeling of brotherhood will only be there if anyone can move freely throughout the territory of India. Then if you want to promote fraternity, this right, this fundamental right should be there in the constitution. So that means this fundamental right is there to promote fraternity, to promote national feeling, that we are the son of the same soil, we all belong to India. But here also restrictions are there. And what are those restrictions? There are two restrictions: interest of general public, and another one is protection of interest of scheduled tribe. That means two restrictions are there under right of movement, and those are interest of general public and the protection of interest of scheduled tribe. And let me tell you one more thing here. When the article 19 clause 1 clause D is saying the right of movement, this is saying that citizens have the right to move freely throughout the territory of India. That means this is talking about the internal movement, and it is not covering the external movement. That means it is not covering the movement to abroad, because movement to abroad, right to travel abroad, is protected under article 21. That is not covered under article 19 clause 1 clause D. Under article 19 clause 1 clause D, the right to movement, the right to internal movement, that means within the territory of India, is covered. Then there is article 19 clause 1 clause E, which is talking about right of residence, right to residence. That means this fundamental right is there. What is the purpose of providing this fundamental right? The reason for providing this fundamental right is to remove the internal barriers within the territory of India, because by this fundamental right, as this fundamental right is present, every citizen can travel freely and settle down in any part of the state or any union territory. That means citizens can travel freely and can settle down also in any part of the state or union territory. That means this is done to remove internal barriers, and this fundamental right is also there to promote fraternity, to remove internal barrier, but this fundamental right is also not absolute. There are reasonable restrictions. And what are those reasonable restrictions of right to residence? And the reasonable restrictions are interest of general public and protection of interest of scheduled tribe. So the reasonable restrictions under right of movement and right to residence are same. And what are those? Those are interest of general public and protection of interest of scheduled tribe. Then there was a fundamental right under article 19 clause 1 clause F, and that is right to property. Why I am saying there was a fundamental right? Because now this is repealed. through 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So earlier this was there, right to property under Article 19 clause 1 clause F, but now this is been repealed. That means, so this fundamental right was covering the right to acquire, hold and dispose of property, but now this is deleted through 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. Now we'll talk about Article 19 clause 1 clause C, which is talking about right of trade and occupation. And this article is saying that all citizens have the right to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation or trade or business. But then this fundamental right is also not absolute. Then what are the reasonable restrictions? One reasonable restriction is in the interest of general public, and another one is that the state can prescribe professional or technical qualification. That means, suppose tomorrow you want to become doctor but you do not have MBBS degree, then you cannot practice, because then the state is prescribing some professional or technical qualification for certain occupation, for certain profession. Because if you want to become doctor, then for example, if you want to become doctor, then you have to qualify MBBS, then you should have a MBBS degree. And another reasonable restriction is that state can carry on any trade or any business to the exclusion of private citizens. It can be wholly or partially. That means state can have monopoly. So these are the three reasonable restrictions. One is in the interest of general public, another one state can prescribe professional or technical qualification, and another one is state can carry on any trade or business to the exclusion of private citizens either wholly or partially. That means state has the right of monopoly, and state needs not to justify why it is practicing monopoly. There is no need for the state to justify. So under Article 19, originally there were 7 rights, but now the right to acquire, hold and dispose of property is deleted through 44th Amendment Act 1978. So now Article 19 guarantees to all citizens 6 rights. So now there is 6 rights, and these 6 rights that are mentioned under Article 19, these are protected against state action and not private individuals. That means these rights are only available against the state action. And when I was teaching you the 6 rights covered under Article 19, I was also telling you about the reasonable restrictions also, and all those reasonable restrictions are mentioned in Article 19 itself, in Article 19 clause 2. So this is Article 19 for you.